Hello, I'm Ira Mukhoty and I'm a writer of historical nonfiction. But for my latest book, Song of Draupadi, I have chosen fiction, a retelling of the Mahabharata, so a work of mythology. And for the past week, Atta Galata has been running this campaign where they have asked readers and interested persons to write in questions to do with Song of Draupadi, to ask me questions about the book. And I'm very grateful to them for running this wonderful campaign and for all of you who have written in so many questions, so many really interesting and thought-provoking questions, out of which I've chosen three, and these people will be sent a signed copy of Song of Draupadi. So the very first question is by Hitesh, who goes by the handle on Instagram, the real Hitesh21, and he asks, there are so many books on the Mahabharata and Draupadi. What is the uniqueness of this book? And which incident in her life connects you with her story? So this is an excellent question to begin this conversation with, because in fact, even though it is called Song of Draupadi, this book is not centered solely on her. It is in fact the retelling of the main events of the Mahabharata, told entirely through the lens of several women in the story, starting with Ganga and Satyavati. About a dozen women I cover and look at the events only from their point of view. And so the men, if you like, are peripheral to the story, whereas the women are center stage. So it is a reimagining of what the story would have been, what the events would have been like if the women were telling the stories. So in that sense, I think it is slightly different from some of the other, reimaginings and retellings, of which there have been quite a few. And which incident in her life connects me to her story? So I think that would be the incident which happens rather later on in the story, before the war begins, when the men are still debating whether the Pandavas are still debating whether they should go to war with their cousins. And there's a lot of back and forth between the two parties. And Draupadi suddenly realizes that all this time she had thought that she was perhaps central to the events, whereas actually the men are using her as a pawn in their game, and they are making very pragmatic decisions, and she is just being used as an excuse. And she realizes that there's no one really to stand up for her, no brother, no father, no husbands, and not even her great friend, her Sakha Krishna. And she realizes that she must stand up for herself. So that really resonated very strongly with me. The second question is by Rahul Vishnoi, who goes by the name Kitabi on Instagram, who says, for someone who was named after her father, born as a tool of revenge and forced to accept 5 men, and then went through abuse at the hands of royal men, was Draupadi an icon for feminism or a victim of patriarchy? So another excellent question there, and the answer is that she was really a bit of both, because she lived in a time which was intensely patriarchal. The time of the epics was already, we see many of the structures come into place which have become, which start to cloister the lives of women. Whether it was restricting, them to only a married status, they were not really encouraged to do much else beside that. The number of duties that they had to do in their, lives, for their husbands, for their children. So we start to see this tightening of the patriarchy around them. So she was very much a woman who operated within these constraints, and yet despite that, she was able to push back and challenge many of the notions. And where some of the women, for example, like Kunti and Satyavati, managed to play the system from within, so they accepted these conditions imposed upon them and used them to their advantage. Draupadi, in my reckoning, fought against these systems, and she tried to make them different from what they were, and she tried to challenge them, and she tried to make a space for herself on her own merit, not simply as a wife or as a mother. So I find that she, in that sense, her story resonates for women even in the 21st century, because that is very true of us even today. The third question is by Shijani Sen, who asks, since time immemorial, we have seen women as a victim to society's attack. Draupadi had to accept 5 Pandavas as her husbands, even if she didn't want to. Whenever it comes to women, there has been a regressive tendency, despite living in a progressive, modernized era. Do you think that we as women are always destined to accept destiny and fate blindly? Now, this is an excellent question too, and there were many, many questions along this vein, similar sort of questionings that people had. And what I would like to say to this is that we certainly do not have to accept this fate. And secondly, this fate, which is supposedly imposed upon us, is often rewritings and retellings imagined by men, whereas women do not lead these lives which are so tame and so orderly as we were often presented to us. So we must remember this: the rewritings, the history writings, are often it's the men who tell us these stories, and it is them who come. Even when a woman has done something extraordinary and out of line with what society expects of her, there will be a later retelling which recasts her in a different light and makes us believe that women have always accepted their fate blindly. But this has not been true. Since time immemorial, women have fought against the system. So it is certainly not for us to blindly accept our fate in the 21st century, but to create a better future for our daughters going ahead. So thank you so much for taking part in this wonderful initiative by Attagalata.